When I first moved into the old apartment complex, I didn't think much of the place. It had a certain charm, the kind that only age and history can give a building. The floors creaked underfoot, the walls were slightly cracked, and the air always seemed a little too cold. But it was cheap, and that's what mattered to me at the time. As I signed the lease, the landlord gave me a peculiar warning. His voice was serious, as if he had rehearsed the line 100 times. "Never open the door to the basement," he said. I remember laughing awkwardly, thinking it was some kind of strange joke. Who gives that kind of warning to a new tenant? But his expression didn't change, and he added, "I mean it, for your own sake." I nodded and didn't ask any more questions. Honestly, I thought it was a bit of a dramatic flourish, something to add a little mystery to an otherwise forgettable place. Besides, I wasn't one to go poking around in basements. I had moved here to get away from everything. Life, people, my past. I had no interest in what was behind some dusty old door. But then the odd things started happening. At first, they were small. Whispers. I thought I was just imagining it. The sound of a soft, almost unintelligible murmur late at night, just on the other side of the wall. I convinced myself it was the neighbors, maybe their TV, or just the old pipe settling. I ignored it, chalking it up to the quirks of living in an aging building. But then came the vibrations. They were subtle at first, just a faint hum that would pulse through the walls at random times. I assumed it was the heating system or something mechanical. Still, it made the place feel uneasy, like the walls were alive with a low, constant energy. Every time it happened, I found myself glancing toward the door that led down to the basement. It was always locked, of course, but I could never shake the feeling that something was happening down there, just out of sight. The rule seemed so simple at first. Never open the basement door. But as time went on, the idea of the door gnawed at me. What was so special about that basement? Why the warning? The more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed my thoughts. I should have known then that nothing good would come from my curiosity. After the whispers and vibrations, things started getting weirder. At first, I tried to rationalize everything. It was an old building after all. Creaks and groans were normal, right? But as the days went on, the oddities became harder to ignore. It started with small things, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. I'd set my keys on the counter, walk away, and when I came back, they'd be on the table. I thought I was just forgetting where I'd put them, but then it began happening with more than just my keys. Books shifted from one shelf to another, lights flickered at random times, and my kitchen chairs seemed to be slightly out of place every morning. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But one night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged slowly across the floor. I got up, heart pounding in my chest, and went to check. When I reached the kitchen, the chairs were pulled away from the table, perfectly aligned in a row, facing the basement door. That door. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, staring at it. I hadn't touched the chairs. No one else had been in the apartment. I quickly shoved them back under the table and locked myself in my bedroom for the rest of the night, refusing to look at the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me. Then there was the cold. It seemed to come from nowhere, an icy draft that would snake through the apartment, biting at my skin. No matter how high I turned up the heat, that cold lingered, and it always seemed to be coming from the direction of the basement. Every time I passed the door, I could feel the air around it drop, like whatever was behind it was pulling warmth from the room, stealing it away. It wasn't natural. I tried to talk to my neighbors about it. They were a strange bunch, quiet and distant, but I figured they'd have some explanation for the oddities of the building. When I asked them if they'd experienced anything similar, their reactions were all the same. Their faces would harden, their eyes would darken, and they'd cut the conversation short. "There's nothing down there worth seeing," one of them said, avoiding my gaze. "Just don't open the door." Another neighbor was even more direct. "You'll regret it if you open that door." His voice was cold, almost threatening. No one would say more than that. It was as if the whole building was in on some unspoken agreement to never discuss the basement, never acknowledge its existence beyond that one rule. And yet, the more they refused to talk about it, the more the door seemed to call to me. Every flicker of the lights, every cold gust, every time I heard those faint whispers, it all seemed to lead back to that basement. My mind kept going back to that warning. You'll regret it if you open that door. But by then, I was already regretting not knowing what was behind it. I managed to ignore it for a while, pretending that I was fine, that all the weirdness was just a product of living alone in an old, creaky building. But the truth was, the basement door had taken over my thoughts. Every time I walked by it, my eyes would linger just a little longer, my hand itching to reach for the doorknob. The warnings echoed in my head, louder with each passing day, but so did my curiosity. It was a cold night when everything finally reached its breaking point. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it, scratching. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the basement. My heart began to race. I sat up, straining to listen, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trapped down there, trying to claw its way out. I tried to calm myself. It's just a rat, I thought. Or maybe a raccoon that got in through some broken window. I even told myself that if I didn't check it out, it could end up damaging the building, maybe chew through some wires or worse. It was an excuse, I knew that. But in that moment, it was all I needed. I got out of bed and crept down the hall, each step slower than the last. The scratching continued, persistent, like nails raking across wood. By the time I reached the basement door, I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the door, my hand hovering over the knob. Don't do it. You'll regret it. The warnings whispered in the back of my mind, but I shoved them aside. I told myself it was just my imagination, that all of this was nothing more than paranoia. How ridiculous was I being, scared of a basement? I turned the knob. The door opened with a soft creak, the sound echoing down into the blackness below. A wave of cold air rushed past me, chilling me to the bone. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, staring down into the darkness. Couldn't see a thing. The light switch was somewhere on the wall, but I didn't bother looking for it. My hand shook as I grabbed a flashlight from the nearby drawer and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow staircase that led down into the basement. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, one foot in front of the other. The scratching had stopped, and for a second, I wondered if I had imagined it. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the silence was deafening. I swept the flashlight around the room. The basement was small, cluttered with old furniture covered in dust, broken appliances, and stacks of boxes that seemed untouched for years. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that explained the sounds I had heard. And yet, the cold down here was different. It wasn't just cold, it was freezing. My breath fogged up in front of me, and I could feel the chill seeping into my skin. I shivered, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Then I heard it again. A faint scratching, this time coming from the far corner of the room. My flashlight flickered as I slowly turned toward the sound. There, behind a stack of boxes, was another door. Smaller, older, and far more decrepit than the one I had just opened. I stepped closer, the scratching growing louder. It was definitely coming from behind that door. Just an animal, I told myself again. It's just an animal. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Everything about this basement felt wrong. My hand trembled as I reached for the smaller door, its wood splintered and worn from years of neglect. I hesitated, my heart thudding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew I was making a mistake, but I was already in too deep. I turned the knob. The door opened with a groan, the old wood protesting as it revealed the space behind it. I expected to find some storage room or crawl space, maybe even just a dead end. But what greeted me was something I could never have imagined, something I can barely even describe. At first, there was only darkness, thicker than anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was like the darkness was alive, swirling and shifting in front of me. My flashlight flickered, the beam faltering as though the shadows were absorbing the light, swallowing it whole. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows began to move, twisting and writhing like a mass of living smoke. There were shapes in the dark, indistinct figures that flickered in and out of focus, stretching and bending in ways that made my stomach turn. It was as if the very air in front of me was bending, warping under some impossible force. I tried to tear my eyes away, but I couldn't. The shadows seemed to reach out, pulling me in with their unnatural movement. I could feel a cold pressure building in my chest, like something was squeezing the air out of my lungs. My skin prickled, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Whatever I had unleashed, it wasn't just a presence. It was aware of me, and then something moved from within the swirling mass. At first, it was just a flicker, something shifting at the edge of my vision. But then it grew bigger, clearer, and undeniably real. A shape emerged from the shadows, its form barely discernible, like it was both there and not there at the same time. It wasn't human, or at least it wasn't anymore. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jagged, and its eyes, those eyes, they were hollow voids of darkness that seemed to see through me, into me. Before I could react, it lunged. I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the floor, its light sputtering out completely. I felt a rush of air, freezing cold, like I had been plunged into an icy lake. I gasped, choking on the sudden pressure around me. Something had escaped, something ancient, something malevolent. I could feel it, like a heavy weight pressing down on me, filling the air with a sense of dread so profound that I could barely think. In that moment, I realized the truth. The door I had opened wasn't just an entrance to some forgotten part of the building. It had been a seal, a barrier, and now I had broken it. I scrambled backward, desperate to get away, but the thing that had escaped was faster, its presence overwhelming. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, numbing my body as the shadows around me closed in. I could hear a low, guttural sound, like a growl or a whisper, filling the space, vibrating through the walls. It spoke no words, but the meaning was clear. It was free, and I was trapped with it. The darkness grew thicker, swallowing everything in its path. I could barely see the outline of the door anymore, but I knew it was too late. I had unleashed something that should never have been disturbed, something far beyond my understanding. My head spun with the weight of my mistake, the warning echoing in my mind. Never open the door. But I had, and now there was no going back. I don't remember how I got back upstairs. The next thing I knew, I was in my apartment. The door to the basement slammed shut behind me. My heart was still racing, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I stood there in the dim light of my kitchen, hands trembling as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. But no amount of rational thought could explain it. Whatever was down there, it wasn't human, it wasn't natural. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination, some trick of my mind playing off the eerie atmosphere of the building. But the reality of what I had unleashed was impossible to ignore. My apartment had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and shift whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. Every night, the scratching would return, louder, more frantic, but this time it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from within the walls, moving closer. I stopped sleeping. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, the presence. It wasn't just in the apartment anymore. It was in my mind, twisting my thoughts, warping my dreams. I would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, my heart pounding as if something had been watching me, waiting. The visions started soon after. They were always fleeting, just glimpses at first. I'd see something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the hallway, or a shadow crossing the room. But when I turned to look, there would be nothing. But deep down, I knew it was there, lurking just out of sight. One night I saw it fully. I was in the bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror, trying to convince myself that I was just tired, that it was all stress. But then the reflection behind me shifted. It wasn't me anymore. It was it. That same twisted figure. Its limbs too long. Its eyes hollow and black. I froze, unable to move, as it slowly tilted its head, those empty eyes locking onto mine through the mirror. When I turned around, nothing was there, but the feeling remained. I wasn't alone. After that, things escalated quickly. The lights would flicker uncontrollably, plunging the apartment into darkness at random times. I heard footsteps pacing the hallway at night, but when I opened the door, the hall would be empty. Objects moved by themselves. Books tumbling off shelves, chairs scraping across the floor. The air was constantly freezing, no matter how many layers I put on or how high I cranked the heat. The worst part was the whispers. They were no longer coming from the basement, they were coming from everywhere. I'd hear them in the walls, under the floorboards, sometimes even in my own head. Soft, unintelligible words, like someone speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but the malice behind them was clear. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and made for the door, desperate to escape this nightmare. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I was met with an overwhelming sense of dread, like an invisible wall pushing me back. My head spun, my vision blurred, and I could feel it. The presence was stronger now. It was in me. There was no running from it. That's when I realized it had been waiting for me. All this time, the door hadn't just kept something locked away. It had been a barrier to protect me, to keep it contained. And I had shattered that barrier. Now, whatever I had unleashed had seeped into every corner of my life. There was no escaping it, no shutting it back inside the basement. It wasn't just haunting me. It had claimed me. Every night, I feel it growing stronger, feeding off my fear, off my thoughts. I can sense it watching me, moving through the shadows of my apartment, waiting. I don't know what it wants, but I know this, there's no way out. I opened the door, and now it's part of me. I'm not alone anymore, and I never will be.